Remember Henry James from college as one of those, if you can make your way through the ambassadors, you deserve a BA. And certainly the later you read Henry James, the more difficult it is to do that. I mean, goodness gracious, The Wings of the Dove. You think of those books that you might have been forced to read. And I never had the courage to offer Henry James to you. It's hard to teach Henry James as well. But last spring, something happened to make him rise in my mind. And you are pretty generous in letting me do what I want to do as a group. I've just about reached the bottom of the barrel in terms of my expertise, too. I mean, one of these days I'm going to have to repeat something I did in 1950 or whatever. The novel we were doing last spring, if you recall, was Ford Madox Ford's The Good Soldier. And among my personal insights, something I've never read by a critic, though a critic had to point it out, was a curious coincidence, but it's not a coincidence, I'm sure, that the young girl in The Good Soldier, who the soldier falls in love with at the end of his, nearing the end of his life, is a woman named Nancy Rufford. And Nancy goes crazy, if you recall, because the good soldier cannot, for the first time in his life, cannot not let himself go. And she becomes trapped in the sexual mores of these adults, and she goes insane. And you remember the narrator, John Dowell, ends up being her nursemaid. And at the very end of the book, Nancy Rufford, for the first time, has broken a kind of trance that she's moved into. And in the middle of dinner, Nancy says, shuttlecock. Remember? It's the only word that she has said. And the word is left unexplained in the book. It's not ever really clarified. And there's a further coincidence, and that is that the woman before Nancy Rufford, who has become entrapped in the wild of The Good Soldier, is a young woman named Maisie Maiden, remember, who was brought back from India. And so, as in detective novels, once is an accident, twice is not a coincidence. And as far as I'm concerned, there's no coincidence that in The Good Soldier, Ford Madox Ford, who was a very good friend and a student of Henry James and called him the master and walked the streets outside of Rye, chose a name for one character, Maisie, and then a word which is the impetus behind another, behind the very novel in which the name Maisie appears, and that is what Maisie knew. So I've told students in the beginning that this is for me a classic example of a writer nodding to a master. Maisie and shuttlecock. And that made me think, gosh, I would love to try to do Henry James. Even if the first day I get 60 people and next Wednesday there are only 5 of you back, which is the danger with Henry James. Because Henry James requires a very different stance, I think, for those of us, and that's most of us, who in the 20th century want a writer to be clear, simple, straightforward, right? Easy to read declarative sentences, lots of exact description of events. Discussions are quoted rather than referred to. They're not indirect. Well, none of those things hold true for Henry James. And if you picked up what Maisie knew and read any of it, you know you're right back into that world where the narrative itself takes primacy over everything else. The voice takes primacy. And you may read a paragraph, which is 2 pages long, describing a conversation in which you get 3 words from each person, rather than the conversation being given to you. Style of narration has changed in Henry James. But you know, you and I have never really addressed the issue of narrative voice and how you approach reality through a narrator who is extremely prominent. In fact, through a narrator who gives us reality filtered radically through his perspective. And it seems to me that's one of the great achievements of Henry James. I've been thinking about how do I start this, because when I begin a novel with you, I'm sure you all have got my technique down. The first day, I assume that some of you have read ahead and maybe have read the book, but that most of you are just waiting to see. You're a fairly critical audience, and you're not going to read a book if you're not going to enjoy what you're going to read. So that means that the first day of a 3-day series, I assume that most of you are buying the book now and trying to decide whether you really want to read what Maisie knew. And so I've got a couple of challenges. One, how do I lecture or speak to an audience that has not experienced the book as a whole. The other one is obviously, how do I make you want to do it, which is the biggest challenge of all, especially with somebody with a reputation for difficulty such as James has. So what I tend to do is to begin slowly, talk quite a bit about the broad context of the book, the outline of the plot, and then do some reading to you pretty straightforward from the book, from the beginning. And we're going to focus on the opening chapters. I will not definitely go beyond chapter 9 today, which is only about 50 pages. Next week we'll try to cover the midsection, and then the great crises or climax in this book are in the third section. So if you miss next Wednesday, you will still be able to come to if you can only stomach 2 of Henry James. A couple of points about what we're going to come to with this book. This is not The Golden Bowl, and it's not Wings of the Dove. So it's not the latest Henry James, meaning that James is not at its most extended, diffuse, difficult. It's fairly easy, Henry James. It's a book which is a wonderful example of James in his early mid-years. It's very readable. And I don't think there's a James novel that raises an issue more fascinating in and of itself. And the issue is the gradual growth of the awareness of the adult world in the minds of a child. The child is Maisie, who is a young girl. Someone said at lunch, I imagine her to be about 9. Well, James is, I can't find a reference that pins Maisie's age down. But she's a little girl who's growing up in an adult world in which adults, it's hard to talk about. They do their thing in the presence, but without educating the meaning of their thing of a young girl. So I have a very nice cover. We have different editions, so this is going to make it a little more difficult. You have the penguin and I have the anchor, and I think it's probably out of print. If you take a look at my cover, I really like this cover because it's a picture of a little girl sitting on a hassock, it looks like, and over in the corner are 2 adults. And the man is about to embrace a woman. She's sitting there in innocence, staring, right? What do children know of the complexities of adult life? And it's made even more fascinating because this is the world of Henry James, which is the world of 1885, 1890. The people involved are people of social circumstance. They could be British, they could be American, but they have wealth. And they have nannies, and they have governesses, and they're called Sir Claude, right? And Lady so-and-so. You know the world of Henry James. It's the male version of the world of Edith Wharton, right? So these are not people who labor for a living. The people aren't, I get up at 5:30 every morning and go to school and teach whether I like it or not. These people don't. But all adults live in a world of adult relationships doing adult things. And the crucial issue here is the issue of marriages breaking up, mothers and fathers having lovers, and living their relationships with each other and with their lovers around the world of a child who's trying to understand. And yet, of course, you don't say to your children, well, your father and I are getting divorced, and each of us have our lover, all right? They're not told those things. James had a concept. I taught this once at the UW, and maybe more than once at the UW. And I remember the fascinating difficulty. Our college students expect that love and sex are going to be drawn for them, right? I mean, if there's a sexual relationship, not only will you know what's going on, it'll be photographed and put in a book for you, right? But in the world of Henry James, they don't photograph it. They don't describe, act by act what's happening in the adult life. Everything is indirect in Henry James. And yet, people in 1880 and 1890 still did the things they do today. Right? If the wife of Bath had 5 husbands and wore 3 old men out in bed before marrying 2 young men, well, it could happen today and it could happen in the 19th century. The point being, people are people, and marriages broke up and they had their adult relationships in James's day as they did in Chaucer's and as they do today. James's genius in this book is to ask himself, how do these things come to the pawns that are beneath the adults as they play their game? And if you've read 50 pages of this book, you've already caught that he's not going to describe any bedroom action. This is not his style. But there is an enormous involvement of people playing their bedroom games in this book. And his genius in this book is to go into the mind of the child and essentially to stay there. And to have Maisie, the innocent girl, 9 years old, 10 years old, watching her parents' marriage break up, watching her father fall into an affair with her governess, right? But not knowing that's what's going on. Watching her mother fall in love with a man named Sir Claude, and her mother and her father, they get married again, and so she's got two mothers and two fathers. And then the stepfather decides that the stepmother is pretty good looking, right? And the stepmother and the stepfather, they start an affair. And the mother and the father, they find somebody else. Have you got it? I mean, you couldn't get more adult fiction than this novel. It should be rated X, right? It really should be rated X. And throughout the whole experience, Maisie is trying to find what Mrs. Wicks would call a moral sense. She's one of her governesses, right? There's a great question at the end of the book. Have you developed any moral sense at all? Mrs. Wicks says, right? Well, how do children develop moral senses? They get them from the adults around them, don't they? And Maisie, who's this little girl, who learns a lesson early on. Does anybody know what her lesson is? Be stupid, right? Because mom's going to say, what did your dad tell you about me? Right? She's learned to be a receptacle of other people's venom because mom and dad hate each other's guts, right? And she's learned that you don't answer questions. You don't answer questions. And you just sit there and listen. It's a marvel. That's why I love this picture. The little girl, you notice what color she is? It's white, right? Innocent. Man in black, woman in gold, right? I think I like it better than your picture, which is a more beautiful painting. Well, even there, look at the upper right-hand corner. It does imply things are going on, doesn't it? The dark world. But that looks more like a housemaid than a father or stepfather. The innocent child. That's what this is about. So today what I want to do is try to get you into Henry James and into the novel What Maisie Knew. And among the first things I want to point out before we start reading is that there's a curious miracle about Henry James. If you read Henry James silently, I've always said it took me 100 pages before I could read him. I remember telling this group that one time, that for me, when I write Henry James, the first 50 pages, it's like I'm riding a horse, and I don't know how to do it, and the horse is going up and I'm going down, you know, because I can't get into the rhythm of the sentences. You know what it's like when you're out of sync with a horse? It's just kaboom, kaboom. And then something happens in my mind, and I get into the rhythm of the sentences, and you realize you don't have to bounce at all, right? You just go with the horse. It usually takes me, at least 50 pages before I get into Jamesian rhythm, right? I mean, if you go from Hemingway to James, you know what I'm talking about, right? And I know that students have told me from the beginning, oh, his sentences are so long and nothing ever happens, right? I can't stand it. And then I say, you've got to rearrange your definition of what happens. Yesterday I had a student. I took a day off in American Lit and read them the story by James Thurber, The Catbird Thief. Anybody know that story? A wonderful, hilarious story of a meek man's revenge against a woman with a braying laugh, right? And I read the story, and then I read them a couple other Thurber pieces. I want to give them a little humor. And we read about his high school days, you know, when you have a Ohio State University football player who's so stupid he can't even answer what kind of transportation he can come to school in. He couldn't answer, he didn't know the word transportation. And I thought for these kids, you know, they're going to really enjoy Thurber. I mean, what a break. We just finished reading John Woolman's diary, a Quaker diary about slavery, and we're doing, you know, they want a break. The very first question I got from a kid was, Dr. Culbert, yeah? Why did it take so long? Why did you go on and on and on? It's not funny. Why didn't you just tell us? There's nothing funny about that. You know what that does to your heart? You know? And the kids don't appreciate Thurber because he takes too long to tell a story. At least I knew I was coming here. You know. The point being, the story of his university days is the story of Thurber and the professor, right? And the professor's frustration at this kid who can't get, every time he looks into a microscope, all he sees is nothing. And the professor going crazy, you see something, you do see something, you do see something. No, I don't. And you and I know Thurber went blind, so it makes it even poignant and funny. Well, what the kids didn't understand, what this boy didn't understand, Joe, is that the whole point of Thurber humor is the way it's told. And if you do Thurber in 5 sentences, it's not funny. There's nothing funny in Thurber in 5 sentences. Well, how you tell that to a 17-year-old? The thing about Henry James, I think, is the same. You have to get into the Jamesian perspective. And the oddity of James, for me, is that he feels like he doesn't know how to write anything except long, complicated, intellectual sentences, and the later the novel, the worse it gets. In his later years, as he got more and more sophisticated in his sentence style, someone visited him one day, and they found that he was dictating his current novel, and it was something on the order of the ambassadors. And they discovered that James had, for some years, given up writing his books. He dictated his books. And that the famous Jamesian style of extended sentences that correct themselves and refine themselves as they move along, you know how I'm talking, so the sentence goes on, was really James dictating to his secretary. And he would begin a sentence, and the dictation process and the refinement of his style is him as he thinks and meditates and clarifies to say exactly what he wants said. He didn't do what most writers do, which is write it out, cross out, rearrange, do it over again. And the older he got, the more dictatorial he got, there's a nice word, and the more difficult and complicated his sentences got. I read that many years ago, and the next time I taught James, I said, I'm going to read him out loud to myself. And I discovered that few writers read out loud as wonderful as Henry James. If you can't read him silently, try reading him out loud, and you will hear the clarification and the intellect and the intelligence. You can almost feel the master in his portliness, walking around his study, saying these sentences to his secretary as she writes them down. I was reading some Henry James this week to prepare myself, obviously, for you, and I did it out loud. And once I was amazed, as I always have been. If you read The Beast in the Jungle out loud, you will love every word of it. So we shall see. Now, let's go back to this particular book. You don't have, or do you or not, have his preface to What Maisie Knew in your text? Is it in there?
Yeah.
Okay. Since our pagination is different, it's going to be harder than I thought. Open up to the preface, and if you can find yourself, please do. He wrote for the 1909 edition prefaces to his major books, and even rewrote some of the books, as you know, so you have a choice whether to read the American as it first came out or read the American as he rewrote it. Most scholars say read the original. I mean, get James easy while you can. In the yes. The preface is what he wrote, right? So turn to the preface. It starts with "I recognize again." You find that? Okay. James' novels, according to James, are really like plants growing or flowers growing. He said several times when he talks about his books that what happens with his books is that he's sitting someplace, and over his shoulder he hears a comment. Maybe just, I walk around Green Lake. You'd be amazed at the half sentences a person hears who's walking quietly around Green Lake. You walk around Green Lake and all of a sudden you hear, and then I punched him right on the nose and, you want to follow what was the rest of that. That's the way James created books. And in the preface, as he told his readers how he got this novel going, I want you to catch what he's doing. The first paragraph. How about the second sentence maybe? The accidental mention had been made to me of the manner in which the situation of some luckless child of a divorced couple was affected under my informant's eyes by the remarriage of one of his parents. I forget which. So that thanks to the limited desire for its company expressed by the step-parent, the law of its little life, its being entertained in rotation by its father and mother, wouldn't easily prevail. Whereas each of these persons had at first vindictively desired to keep it from the other, so at present the remarried relative sought now rather to be rid of it. That is, to leave it as much as possible and beyond the appointed times and seasons on the hands of the adversary, which malpractice, resented by the latter as bad faith, would of course be repaid and avenged by an equal treachery. The wretched infant was thus to find itself practically disowned, rebounding from racket to racket like a tennis ball or a shuttlecock. Yeah. Wonderful prose, isn't it? What had he heard? He heard somebody speaking. Usually James would overhear somebody speaking. The Ambassador, for example, is a novel that was written in response to a comment that Henry James heard William Dean Howells make. Howells is one of my babies, you know. But at one time, Howells commented in James's hearing that if he had any advice to give anybody, it would be to live while they could, to live as much as they could. And James thought about that. I mean, Howells had obviously lived, but he had felt that life had passed him by, and he wrote the whole novel, The Ambassador. Grab your opportunities while you can. He heard some people talking about a child who was in a divorce situation, nothing more than a shuttlecock. Shuttlecock is a birdie, right? Badminton birdie. The parents, when they divorced, each thought the other parent wanted the child. So in the court conflict, what did they do? If you want her, I want her. And the divorce is structured in such a way that the two parents are fighting over the custody of the child, and then one of the parents remarries. The step-parent doesn't want that child, so the parent who's now remarried pushes the child off to the other parent, and as soon as the other parent realizes that she's not wanted by the ex, what does that person do? You're going back. And so the child becomes a tool, a shuttlecock, batted back and forth, symbol of the animosity of the mother and the father, who, if the other one wants her, they want her. If the other one doesn't want her, they don't want her. James thought, gosh, what does that do to a child? This book has been written 100 years. It's not over. I have students right now who are the victims of acrimonious divorces, and some of us have gone through them, in which the parent conflict is so strong that they simply cannot, even with love, they simply cannot withhold it from the children. I think among the most admirable, personally, among the most admirable traits parents can have is the trait, which is probably the most difficult trait, of divorcing and yet working as a team and loving the children and not taking the anger for the other parent out on the children. And that's what this book is about. Nothing has changed. What James does is think about the child and then grow from the seed of that insight, the shuttlecock, a whole novel, and the novel is the novel, what Maisie knew. A couple of points that we will look at in the preface before we turn to the book. This is the end of the next long paragraph, about 2/3 down. At last, according to the residuum, find that sentence, anybody? Page 24. He's been thinking about that, the dramatic quality of that. As I have called it, reached, I was in the presence of the red dramatic spark that glowed at the core of my vision, and that, as I gently blew upon it, burned higher and clearer. You see his image? It's like a coal that he ponders and ponders, and he blows on it to start a fire, and the fire is to be a novel. So he ponders and ponders. One of the paradoxes of Henry James is that he starts with nothing, and inside his nothing, as he grows it, is this tremendous conflict, all of which is inside here. Nobody gets murdered in a James novel, right? And you don't see any sex, but there are things going on. This precious particle was the full ironic truth, the most interesting item to be read into the child's situation. For satisfaction of the mind, in other words, the small, expanding consciousness, who would that be? The child, Maisie, who's trying to understand what is going on. Children are constantly being lied to by their parents. Not in the sense of a verbal lie, but we don't tell them about adult life, do we? Right? 9-year-olds. I have kids who are juniors in high school who don't believe their parents ever had sex. I mean, they simply will not, impossible, they're too old, they're at least 40, right? A student, where did they come from? I have a student, I have a colleague who's a former nun, and she left the convent when she was about 35. And last week, one of our students, who's a teenager, said to a colleague of mine, Miss McCormick, she said, Mr. McCormick, Miss Gary used to be a nun, didn't she? The Catholic said, yes, she used to be a nun. And the student said, she left the convent, right? Yes, she did. Why would she leave the convent when she's too old to do sex? Right? There's... And my heart sank. It's the only reason why a woman would leave the convent to this sophomore. Right? This precious particle was the full ironic truth, the most interesting item to be read into the child's situation. For satisfaction of the mind, in other words, the small expanding consciousness would have to be saved, have to become presentable as a register of impressions. You hear that? The child has got almost like clay or something, right? Adults do things and kids try to figure out what they mean, don't they? They get an impression. What did that mean? If you read even 50 pages into the book, among the pleasures of the early part of this novel is the parents and the step-parents speaking in Maisie's presence in duplicitous ways, so that Maisie hears one thing, but you and I know that the communication is on a different level. For example, why does Maisie have to be there when her future stepmother, now her governess, is living with her father, Theo Farang? Because without the baby, without the child, a single woman can't live in the house of a man, right? So as long as Maisie's there, she's the excuse for her father to have an affair in public with the governess. Once she's married, and now Mrs. Beale, the governess no longer needs Maisie around, does she? Now, Maisie doesn't know any of that stuff. The repetitive phrase being, you're our excuse, right? You're our excuse. You make it possible for us to be together. You bring us together. But to a 9-year-old girl, a governess is a governess, right? A teacher is a teacher. A parent is a parent. So we see, if we're reading with our eyes open, the constant double meaning of almost everything that's said in the first 50 pages, because Maisie can't see them. And saved by the experience of certain advantages, by some enjoyed profit and some achieved confidence, rather than coarsened, blurred, sterilized by ignorance and pain. He wants somehow, I think Henry James was a softie. I think he wants to take a child who might have in real life have been destroyed by this and bring her through it. And reading this novel, what Maisie knew, is really his attempt to take the child who's so battered psychologically, and at the end of the book say, a child can endure this, and children do endure, awful things, and watch the growth of this child to a kind of adulthood. Turn over to the end of the next paragraph, about 20 lines up. No themes are so human. You find that? Page 25. As those that reflect for us out of the confusion of life the close connection of bliss and bale. James is giving you some hints as to what he likes to write about. Happiness and grief are so close together. Maisie's joy and Maisie's pain are so yoked that you can hardly separate them, right? I mean, the moments of pleasure when she's finally embraced by someone she thinks loves her. She loves it so much she can hardly walk away. And that's her difficulty here. The close connection of bliss and bale, of the things that help with the things that hurt us, so dangling before us forever, that bright, hard metal, so strange an alloy, one phase of which is somebody's right and ease, and the other, somebody's pain and wrong. Now that's beautiful prose, is it not? On one side of the coin is somebody's happiness and joy. On the other side is somebody's pain and wrong. And the child, what is it? Because the mother hates the father hates the mother. Who's guilty? Right? Who is guilty? If any of you have read the book, how many of you have read the book yet? Who turns out to be the adult you probably most admire when it's all over? Give me which one? By us, not by Maisie, but by us. Who do you think? Sir Claude? I think so. And who is Sir Claude? Well, yes, he's a playboy, is he not? But Sir Claude has one quality which redeems him in a world where not many others. Though there's a princess or somebody in here who's fairly nice. Give her some money, remember? The Countess, yeah. But Sir Claude truly cares for the child. But by the adult standards, right? I mean, he marries without love. He has an affair without love. When he's still married to the woman he didn't love when he married, right? You see what's happening? We can't use adult standards for who's valuable, because who's valuable is tied to who Maisie sees and who treats her like something more than a person. Who do you like least in the book as you read it? I hate Ida. I just hate Ida, right? This woman who swoops in to the room, right? 5 minutes, totally disrupts the girl. At one point in the book it says, you know how quickly she's going to go by how low cut her gown is, right? Remember that? When her gown is down to here, don't expect her to stay. If her gown is up here, well, Ida is not a mother. So we need to totally rearrange our expectations and see them through the eyes of Maisie, because the good adults are those who have more than a moment. There's somebody else, by the way, who's truly a decent person. Mrs. Wicks, yeah. But she doesn't count. Why? She's a nobody. She's dowdy, right? She's got that hairdo, right? And she's always weeping over the death of poor, what's her name? Marion Claire or something like that. What's her name? Marion? Not Marion. Miriam? Matilda? Does it start with M? Claire, yeah, right. She's got a little girl who's died. Misery. But does Mrs. Wicks care for Maisie? And she's nobody. Does she have any intelligence? Any knowledge? No. Yes. Yeah. And the only person to give her mothering is Mrs. Wicks. Mrs. Wicks, however, has aspirations, doesn't she? What's her weakness? She likes Sir Claude too? Yeah, I think she does. So some of you know that by the time you get to the end of this book, the complications, right? The parents, the step-parents, the lovers of the parents, the lovers of the step-parents, loving each other, right? Adults have their games. Let's start right off. Shall we read a little bit of Henry James today? Turn to the preface. And I want to read these opening pages to you because about half of you have not got into the book, and urge you to enjoy the prose and to get interested in the circumstance of the little girl who doesn't understand. This is the background. The litigation had seemed interminable and had in fact been complicated. But by the decision on the appeal, the judgment of the divorce court. You have a page? Page 35 in your book. Okay, that's all right. Find it? This is the preface before chapter 1. It's what do they call it in your book? Anything? Mine doesn't have a title.
We had the preface. Now
Yeah.
this is the beginning.
The litigation had seemed interminable and had in fact been complicated. But by the decision on the appeal, the judgment of the divorce court was confirmed as to the assignment of the child. I love that. What is she like? She's like a thing. You assign property, don't you? Right? The father, who though bespattered from head to foot, had made good his case, was in pursuance of this triumph appointed to keep her. It was not so much that the mother's character had been more absolutely damaged, as that the brilliancy of a lady's complexion, and this lady's in court was immensely remarked, might be more regarded as showing the spots. James is an indirect narrator, so when you read, if your eyes are sleeping, you're falling asleep, you miss all the fun. What do you know happened at this trial? Yes. About adultery where? On everybody's side. You know, the point is pretty clear. These people went to litigation in their divorce. Maisie was the object of their hatred. Mud was spattered, right? In fact, he uses the word. Yeah, he uses that word. The point that's being made is that on a man, mud doesn't show up quite so vividly, does it, as on a woman. So a woman who does the same thing as a man does is going to look a lot worse. Is that historically true? Yeah. Attached, however, to the second pronouncement was a condition that detracted for Beale Farang from its sweetness. So he got the official custody, but there's a condition. An order that he should refund to his late wife the 2,600 pounds put down by her, as it was called some 3 years before, in the interest of the child's maintenance, and precisely on approved understanding that he would take no proceedings, some of which he had had the administration and of which he could not render. He could render not the least account. Now, what happened? What has happened? How long have they been separated? 3 years. And in the separation, Ida has given Beale 2,600. Is that a lot of money in 1880? Massive bucks. Big bucks. On what grounds? We don't go public. Remember? We don't go public. If this becomes public, I want that money back, and the court has awarded it back. Sounds like who sued for divorce? He did. Beale sued for divorce, yeah. But he doesn't have the money. He is gone. He's been partying. The obligation thus attributed to her adversary was no small balm to Ida's resentment. It drew a part of the sting from her defeat and compelled Mr. Farang perceptibly to lower his crest. What's the image here, by the way? What is Beale? He's a rooster, right? You can just see him. But the obligation of 2,600 pounds, right? Yeah. He was unable to produce the money or to raise it in any way, so that after a squabble scarcely less public and scarcely more decent than the original shock of battle, his only issue from his predicament was a compromise proposed by his legal advisors and finally accepted by hers. Now, those of you who haven't read any Henry James, do you have any trouble following? Easy. It's not. And the oddity is that when you read it out loud, it feels good. I mean, in the mouth. It's tactically a pleasant prose style for some reason. His debt was by this arrangement remitted to him, and the little girl disposed of in a manner worthy of the judgment seat of Solomon. She was divided in two, and the portions tossed impartially to the disputants. Can anybody remind us of the judgment of Solomon that's being referred to? Anybody? What is? Okay, but what was the argument? Anybody? Two women. Right. And could Solomon make up his mind who was the real mother? No. And so he said what? You each get half. And his wisdom is, what happened then?
The real mother said no.
The real mother said, no, let her have the child. And so the one who really loved the child gave her up. Does that happen in the Farang divorce? Do they have an agreement? We'll cut this kid in two. And they do. So Henry James doesn't say it. But the judgment of Solomon, which is to find the parent who loves the child, is used by the court, but the response is not the same. Because you and I find out that neither parent has any love for this little girl in and of herself. And of course, if the two women in Solomon's day didn't care, they would have cut the kid in two, wouldn't they? So there's an implied judgment on James's part here. They would take her in rotation for 6 months at a time. She would spend half the year with each. This was an odd justice in the eyes of those who still blinked in the fierce light projected from the tribunal, a light in which neither parent figured in the least as a happy example to youth and innocence. There's that James. What has happened, obviously? No. During this divorce, what has happened? Publicity. In fact, you can imagine the London Times must have been filled with the Farang divorce. And what have they been saying to each other? About each other. totally unfit for parenting until, well, you can have her 6 months, and I'll have her 6 months. The world goes, what? What? Either parent, obviously, from the newspaper, has no ability to raise a child. What was to have been expected on the evidence was the nomination in loco parentis, there's a classic college phrase, meaning in the place of parents, of some proper third person, some respectable or at least presentable friend. Apparently, however, the circle of the Farangs had been scanned in vain for any such ornament. Do you sense that James has an ironic voice? Yeah. Yeah. So that the only solution finally meeting all the difficulties was, save that of sending Maisie to a home, the partition of the tutelary office in the manner I have mentioned. There were more reasons for her parents to agree to it than there ever had been for them to agree to anything, and they now prepared, with her help, to enjoy the distinction that waits upon vulgarity sufficiently attested. Their rupture had resounded, and after being perfectly insignificant together, they would be decidedly striking apart. As a couple, what were Beale and Ida Farang? Nobody's. But some divorces are so wonderful for the public that from now on they're in the public eye, right? I mean, nothing Jackie Onassis is going to do is ever going to not make her a public figure, right? I mean, the death of her husband and her father. For me, how when I'm thinking about something like speaking to you, things come together in comments, and my experience this summer with my relative really was in my mind. My wife right now is doing substituting in the Seattle Public Schools, and last night she's spending her third day today at Hay Elementary, and she's visited a lot of schools, especially working in for the special ed program as a teacher aide, that type of thing. And now she's working in the office. But last night, just before dinner, she said, you know, there are so many sad children out there, and so many parents who don't know how to raise children. And it breaks her heart as she goes off to these elementary schools and sees these little kids, sometimes 6 or 7 years old, really going through serious, listen, it doesn't have to be abuse, but failure to relate, not getting love, not being supported. And I thought, my goodness, you know, I almost started talking to her about what Maisie knew. They're still there, the little children who need parents, and the parents are often not there. And all you can say in response is kids grow up through those things, don't they? As Maisie does, and many of them become wonderful adults. So turn over to the maybe halfway through this long paragraph. Let's take a look at Beale and Ida. The pair appeared to have a social attraction. Find that?
38.
38 in your book.
No,
37.
37 down the page, yeah.
Okay, about 2/3 down on page 37 for you. The pair appeared to have a social attraction which failed merely as it regards each other. I've known marriages like that. Individually, wonderfully attractive, delightful, outgoing, but they don't see anything in each other. It was indeed a great deal to be able to say for Ida that no one but Beale desired her blood, and for Beale that if he should ever have his eyes scratched out, it would be only by his wife. It was generally felt, to begin with, that they were awfully good-looking, that they really had not been analyzed to a deeper residuum. They made up together, for instance, some 12 feet 3 of stature. And nothing was more discussed than the apportionment of this quantity. Isn't that wonderful? You know Gary and Sandy? Well, together, you know, they're about 20 feet tall. You never think of, I know we have a habit of referring to our married friends always as a duo, right? Yeah, about 6 feet each it could be, or 6'3" and 5'9". Right? People. What's pretty clear, by the way, about Ida, regardless, she's not a short woman. I mean, because once you get Beale up to 6'4", then Ida is, yeah, and also is 12 feet 3, so it's even more than that, I guess, right? I mean, so she's a tall, slender woman. But you call people for us, you know, it's Chris and Jim, right? Bob and Ann. William and what is the Cummings poem from next spring? All along come Eddie and Bill. Remember? Eddie and Bill. One word crammed together. Well, they're talked about their combined stature. The sole flaw in Ida's beauty was a length and reach of arm conducive to her having so often beaten her ex-husband at billiards, a game in which she showed a superiority largely accountable, as she maintained, for the resentment finding expression in his physical violence. Interesting. You get two images. One, the last one is a little bit worse, right? He is a violent man, okay? The other one is much more interesting, of the sight of her like Paul Newman at the, right? Don't date your husband at male games, right? Male egos don't like it. Any game? Bridge? Especially bridge. Chess? Okay. Billiards was her great accomplishment, and the distinction her name always first produced the mention of. What does that tell you about her? There probably is not a game less meaningful than billiards to people in her social status. Billiards is a meaningful game to poor men in the inner city, right? In a bar, in taverns. It's a male game, and you can see why it's important to HUD in Minnesota Facts. But to Ida, this is a pastime, and yet it's her one great advantage. Notwithstanding some very long lines, everything about her that might have been large, and that in many women profited by the license, was, with a single exception, admired and cited for its smallness. James's prose is so indirect. She has very long lines, right? But everything that in another woman would be praised because it was large, for her is small. The exception was her eyes, which might have been of mere regulation size. Regulation size? But which modesty of nature. What does that tell you about her? But it says they could have been regulation size. So where does modesty come? It's not in the size of the eyes, but in it's what you're looking, right? I mean, it's the way you use them. Yes. It's when you see that fellow across the cocktail party and you send a view, right? So it's how you use eyes. She is not modest in her eyes. Does this sound like a 19th century requirement? Yes, keep your eyes on the floor in front of you and so forth. Her mouth, on the other hand, was barely perceptible, and odds were freely taken as to the measurement of her waist. Does she have a small waist? Yes. So people take, what does odds mean? They take bets on it, right? What do you think? 14 inches? 30 inches? There was a day, right? Where are the snows of yesteryear? She was a person. I was thinking about my grandma's wedding dress, which is this big, and we've only known one woman who could get into her wedding dress, 1909. She was only about 4'10", but when Gram died, her arm would hardly have gone through that waist. Yeah. Oh, we're having too much fun here. Let's get serious. She was a person who, when she was out, and she was always out. Can you see that? Produced everywhere a sense of having been seen often. The sense, indeed, of a kind of abuse of visibility, so that it would have been, in the usual places, rather vulgar to wonder at her. You can read Henry James. The trouble with James is, for a teacher, is that you can stop at any moment, and there's something so interesting. The abuse of visibility. I mean, is that not Vanna White? Right? However attractive she is, you've just seen too much of that woman. And Robert Bork, and Robert Kennedy, and Teddy Kennedy, put them all away for 6 years, right? Yeah. Fawn Hall and Donna Rice and Gary Hart and Tammy and Jim, yeah. Strangers only did that. Strangers only did what? Wonder, yeah. Pretty clear. She is so much a part of the social scene that people don't look at her, but if you don't know her, do you look at her? Yeah, okay, so she's there. Did it very much. It was an inevitable way of betraying an alien habit. Like her husband, she carried clothes, carried them as a train carries passengers. People had been known to compare their taste and dispute about the accommodation they gave these articles, though inclining on the whole to the commendation of Ida as less overcrowded, especially with jewelry and flowers. So she's not quite as bad as a train carries passengers, right? You think she's a little bit less overcrowded in certain areas. In the context of a train filled with passengers, I don't know. Yeah, probably is vulgar. Would you say that Ida Farang is not a vulgar woman, in spite of her apparent wealth? I think she is vulgar. Yeah. And she hangs around vulgar people. Sir Claude is the best thing that ever happened to her, and she doesn't appreciate him. Yes, me. By the way, having read as far as we've got about jewelry and flowers, why do you suppose she doesn't cover herself with jewels? Pardon? You don't? You think her dangling earrings would get caught in the... I don't know. I suspect, gee, that's an interesting point. Yeah. I think they are really skating thin ice. They're the people who hang around, both Varangs, who hang around the jet set, right? And just are always there when a party's being given. You notice that she doesn't seem to give a lot of parties. People come to her house. There's a wonderful image of poor Maisie on the balcony. Remember? At the beginning of the novel, James refers several times to Maisie up on the balcony hearing the laughter of people downstairs. So people come to visit, and women have a wonderful time, but there's no sense of excessive money being spent at all. They can't really afford to send her to Brighton school. Okay. Right, and in fact, I thought about that when the point about her décolletage. You know, if she thinks she is herself beautiful, then the low-cut dress and the lack of a necklace really calls attention to it. A necklace is to decorate and to call attention away from your flesh, but she wants the world to see Ida. Yeah, sweet as apple cider. Here's the father. See if you like Beale. Beale Farang had natural decoration. He didn't have flowers and jewelry. A kind of costume in his vast, fair beard, burnished like a gold breastplate. And in the eternal glitter of the teeth that his long mustache had been trained not to hide, and that gave him in every possible situation the look of the joy of life. Can you see him? His mustache, right?
Did he have gold teeth?
No, he had a gold mustache, or gold beard. Yeah. Yeah. No. That would look all right on him, though. He had been destined in his youth for diplomacy and momentarily attached, without a salary, to a legation which enabled him often to say, "In my time in the East," but contemporary history had somehow had no use for him. It had hurried past him and left him in perpetual Piccadilly. What is Piccadilly? It's a square, is it not? So if you're in perpetual Piccadilly, you're like on a carousel, right? I mean, it's a theater district, is it not? So has he done anything of value? No, he's gone off to the east for... Yeah, that's what I mean. So it's like a carousel. If he's right, you could just see him going around Times Square, right? Nothing of substance. Everyone knew what he had. Only $2,500. Now you know why he can't pay Ida her $2,600. 2,500 pounds a year. Is that enough for me to live on with a wife and 2 kids? In 1880? It was then. That is a substantial income for an ordinary person. It's not a substantial income for a person of wealth and position or someone who aspires to it. Only 2,500. What does the phrase "only 2,500" tell you about it? Everybody knew he had only 2,500. No. Who says that? Who says he had only 2,500? Well, who is everybody? Everybody who knows him, says, you know, Bill, nice guy, but he's only got 2,500. So is he with his own social class financially? No. He's with people with considerably more than 2,500, yeah. Poor Ida. People know. People know. All you have to know is that I teach in a Catholic high school and you can figure out my salary. Poor Ida, who had run through everything, had now nothing but her carriage and her paralyzed uncle. This old brute, as he was called, was supposed to have a lot put away. The child was provided for, thanks to a crafty godmother, a defunct aunt of Beale's, who had left her something in such a manner that the parents could appropriate only the income. Buffalo Bill's defunct, E.E. Cummings, right? We used to ride a water smooth silver stallion and shoot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 clay pigeons just like that. Jesus, he was a handsome man.
How do you like your blue-eyed boy?
Yes, how do you? What does defunct mean? Kaput.
Gone.
Kaput. Beyond use. How do you feel like that, you know? Everybody ought to have a dead uncle. Right? That leaves them money. And Uncle Zizi, where did I see that, Uncle Zizi? Oh, Sandy and I saw the movie Gauguin, The Wolf at the Door. He inherits a little money from Uncle Zizi, and the repeated line is, isn't it wonderful to have a dead uncle? Leave you a little money. Okay, we got the two parents in our minds. Let's push on and make our way through a couple chapters here today. Chapter 1 begins with Maisie's patient observation of others. Very first chapter, first paragraph, second sentence, I think it is. It was to be the fate of this patient little girl to see much more than she at first understood, but also, even at first, to understand much more than any little girl, however patient, had perhaps ever understood before. That's the chime that rings the difficulty of her situation. At a time when little girls should be playing with other little girls and playing with their little dolls. Elizabeth, is that her name of the doll? Elizabeth? She's watching adults and taking in. They can't understand, but they take in more than they seem to, right? And that's her faith. She gets a lot of attention. In this, is it the same paragraph? No, the second paragraph, all the way down, you get images of how she is treated. And the opening chapters underscore the radical contrast between the adult world and how adults view children. The greatest effect of the great cause was her own greater importance, chiefly revealed to her in the larger freedom with which she was handled, pulled hither and thither, and kissed, and the proportionally greater niceness she was obliged to show. As a result of the separation and being thrown back and forth every 6 months, everybody's pulling her on their laps, right? And ordinarily, children have a right to be a little standoffish, but now, poor Maisie, you can see it, poor Maisie, your mother and father are divorced. Come on, sit on my lap. Look at her features had somehow become prominent. People look at her and they enjoy being sympathetic. They were so perpetually nipped by the gentleman who came to see her father, and the smoke of whose cigarettes went into her face. Some of these gentlemen made her strike matches and light their cigarettes. Others, holding her on knees, violently jolted, pinched the calves of her legs till she shrieked. Her shriek was much admired, and reproached them with being toothpicks. The word stuck in her mind and contributed to her feeling from this time that she was deficient in something that would meet the general desire. She found out what it was. It was a congenital tendency to the production of a substance to which Model, her nurse, gave a short, ugly name, a name painfully associated at dinner with the part of the joint she didn't like. What is she short on that men like? Fat, right? Your legs are toothpicks. Image this awful, this poor little girl being put on these dirty old men, smoking away, right? Thinking they're being avuncular, right? And pinching her calves. Oh, your little legs are like toothpicks. That's too bad. Men like a little fat on their women, don't they? We never are told. I sort of agree. Somewhere 8 to 10, I would say. I'm just guessing. She was 6, yeah? Yeah, maybe she's 7 then, huh? The time passes, if you've read the first, it just goes 6 months here and then longer than 6 months there. But James is very hard to pin down on that. Whatever it is, she's young enough to remember. And there's nothing like insulting a child in a child's hearing for it to be remembered forever. Right? I think I may have mentioned to you that I'll never forget the moment when I was a small child, probably 9 years old, in my own kitchen with my aunt there, my uncle's new wife, telling my mother how lucky she was that she only had one boy, because she had 2 boys and she hated raising boys. They're just terrible to raise. Now, I'll never forget my Aunt B saying that, and I have hated Aunt B for the last 35 years. I shouldn't say that. I don't hate her, but I don't have any love for her. And she wasn't talking to me. She was talking in my hearing. But I heard that. And can it happen to a child? I remember. And Aunt B has poodles, and I've hated poodles ever since, too. So, poodles are? Not for her. But the point I want you to catch is that from the beginning you see the randomness of people's attention to their words in the presence of a small child. You think children don't hear. They hear. And Maisie looks in the mirror and says, are they too thick? Are my legs? Well, what kind of legs should a 6-year-old girl have? Yeah. Yeah. I prefer the kind of adult who doesn't even see a child. I don't like it. And I remember a friend of mine, I had a friend once who got in the car. I was giving him a ride home, and my son was in the back seat. And this person is simply unaware of children. I mean, they don't exist in his world. And he never said hello to John and never acknowledged his existence. And Sandy was not happy. You say hello to a child. They're a human being. But I prefer that to what you just described, where a child is some kind of physical manifestation that they have to do something with, but what do? You throw it in the air and catch it when it comes down. But neither way recognizes the human independence of the child, right? That they have a right to be greeted. And yeah, very good point. So as you can see, 25, she was familiar at the age of 6 with the fact that everything had been changed on her account. Everything ordered to enable him to give himself up to her. What is among the very first lessons Maisie gets? I want you to know, child, that my whole life now is structured because you are in it. If you weren't in my life, I could be going here, buying that. Isn't that nice? Guilt for existence, right? Guilt for existence, as though the child were responsible for being born. But there are people who do this even without breaking up, right? Or constantly. If you knew what I went through delivering you, kiddo, right? Or we could have a car twice as good as ours if you weren't, right? I feel that way myself, actually, sometimes. Now, I could. Well, Emily's getting $1,600 worth of, right? That's only the beginning? Is that what you said? Well, it'd be cheaper to pull them all. Who is Model? Her first nurse. Model's a curious woman who takes her on vacation. The end of the first chapter, if you've read James, you know that he's a master of structuring chapters. Always ends on an interesting note. Of Model speaking out to her father and saying, you ought to be perfectly ashamed of yourself. You ought to blush, sir, for the way you go on. The carriage, this is at the end of the first 6 months, with her mother in it, was at the door. This is about 3 inches up from the end of chapter 1. He says to Model, my dear woman, I'll settle you presently. Maisie was not at the moment so fully conscious of them as of the wonder of Model's sudden disrespect and crimson face. But she was able to produce them in the course of 5 minutes when the carriage, her mother, all kisses, ribbons, eyes, arms, sweet sounds and sweet smells, strange sounds and sweet smells, said to her, "And did your beastly papa, my guardian, precious angel, send any message to your own loving mamma?" Then it was that she found the words spoken by her beastly papa to be, after all, in her little bewildered ears, from which at her mother's appeal they passed in her clear, shrill voice, straight to her little innocent lips. "He said I was to tell you from him that you are a nasty, horrid pig." What is Model upset about? I mean, that the nurse is speaking to him and saying, "You ought to be ashamed of yourself, the way you go on." Yes, I mean, this girl who's trained to be obedient is speaking out. Does Maisie know what she's doing? She hasn't yet learned the secret of stupidity, but Model does, and so she passes it on. What an excitement. Chapter 2, I think the pre-chapter and then chapter 1 sort of set the scene. I think the book begins at chapter 2, because here we begin with the insight that James picked up and that he evolved into the novel. I want to make sure we hear it. And see if you agree from your own memories or from your own children if this is true. In that lively sense of the immediate, which is the very air of a child's mind, the past, on each occasion, became for her as indistinct as the future. She surrendered herself to the actual with a good faith that might have been touching to either parent. What is James referring to there in children? What is real to children? Now, last Christmas could be 50 years ago. Next Christmas, right, doesn't exist at all. Never comes. For you and I, they come too quickly. But if to a 6-year-old, no. Crudely as they had calculated, they were at first justified by the event. Excuse me. She was the little feathered shuttlecock that they could fiercely keep flying between them. The evil they had the gift of thinking or pretending to think of each other, they poured into her little gravely gazing soul as into a boundless receptacle. And each of them undoubtedly had the best conscience in the world as to the duty of teaching her the stern truth that should be her safeguard against the other. She was at the age for which all stories are true and all conceptions are stories. When I told my relative, we were talking about this, I said, you've got to be free your children from your marital problems with your divorced husband. She said, "I want them to know the kind of man he is." I said, "But he's going to be their father all their life. They need to know how he's made them suffer." Right? It's difficult. So she gets a theory. And Cynthia referred to it. It's the theory of survival, which is stupidity. Right? And the next paragraph talks about that. It's the result of her moral decision not to pass on the evil tale. To tell you the truth, it's one area in this book which I'm not convinced to me has psychological validity. I think it's hard to see a child having that strength. If it was so young, yeah. If perhaps Maisie did it out of not a decision of stupidity, but a sense that the consequences of speaking were not pleasant to her, it would be more realistic to me. But whatever it is, she doesn't pass it on. I don't think you often have to see the consequences of telling somebody they're a horrid pig before you don't do it anymore. And that's probably what's going on here. She was seeing too much, as we see in this chapter. And she meets a new governess in this chapter who's going to become her stepmother, and her name is Miss Overmore. She's a higher class than Model, her nurse. And if we move over to chapter 3, we already start seeing some of the complications. So let's skip over to that and take a look at it at the beginning. I'm trying to decide, since many of you haven't yet read, how much I can skip over here and get it. I think we can. Let's do chapter 3. Does she like Overmore? Yeah, Overmore. What is attractive in Overmore that Model didn't have? She's very pretty. She's young. Does she have more knowledge? Or can she function as a governess? Yeah, she can. Let's watch some of the complications arise in chapter 3. She's very startled since she liked Overmore so much. When her mother said to her, in connection with something to be done before the next migration, is the language he uses, migration. You understand, of course, that she's not going with you. Maisie turns quite faint. Oh, I thought she was. It doesn't in the least matter, you know, what you think. Never matters, does it? Why do you suppose Miss Overmore is not to be going? She's employed by Ida right now, but what is... Ida is inferior to Miss Overmore. I think you're right, she is. But right now Overmore is employed by Ida to be the governess. But isn't it logical that the governess would go with the child and give a child a little bit of continuity from house to house when you're going back and forth? Not if you're Ida, and if... Yes, right. Not yet, but she's going to show up and fall in love with him. But we're talking about... I want to get at Ida right now. Ida's not going to give Beale anything. In particular, no access to a beautiful, young governess. Because it doesn't make any difference what Maisie thinks. Right? That she's connected to Overmore doesn't mean anything at all. You had better indeed, for the future, miss, learn to keep your thoughts to yourself. This was exactly what Maisie had already learned. And the accomplishment was just the source of her mother's irritation. What does that mean? Her mother's really ticked off at Maisie because she won't tell tales out of school, will she? Right, no information. It was of a horrid little critical system, a tendency in her silence to judge her elders, that this lady suspected her, liking as she did for her own part a child to be simple and confiding. She liked also to hear the report of the whack she administered to Mr. Farang's character, to his pretensions to peace of mind, the satisfaction of dealing them diminished when nothing came back. The day was at hand, and she saw it, when she should feel more delight in hurling Maisie at him than in snatching her away. James's understanding of human psychology is wonderful. I think you're already probably catching on to this. What was the great pleasure she got and was no longer allowed to have when Maisie became a little less willing to tell tales? Nothing back. She wants to strike at Beale, and she wants to see or hear how it felt. It's no fun. It's no fun telling stories and then not getting any response. Most of us know that. That's natural. What is she prepared to do then, as James is going to say? If she's not going to be the tale teller, she's going to become she'll become the object itself. She was willing enough to fight over her as long as the fun of the conflict was there, but now Maisie's going to become the object of... That's right. Now she's the shuttlecock. Let's go on a little bit more. Another paragraph or so. Waiting patiently, and above all, waiting till she could come back, there seemed to Maisie a long way around. It reminded her of all the things she had been told, first and last, that she should have if she'd be good, and that in spite of her goodness, she never had it all. Then who will take care of me at Papa's? Heaven only knows, my precious, Miss Overmore replied, tenderly embracing her. There was indeed no doubt that she was dear to this beautiful friend. What could have proved it better than the fact that before a week was out, in spite of their distressing separation and her mother's prohibition and Miss Overmore's scruples, and Miss Overmore's promise. The beautiful friend had turned up at her father's. How long did it take? A week. The little lady already engaged there to come by the hour, a fat, dark little lady with a foreign name and dirty fingers. I'll skip over that. That strange apparition faded before the bright creature who had braved everything for Maisie's sake. The bright creature told her little charge frankly what had happened, that she had really been unable to hold out. She had broken her vow to Mrs. Farang. She had struggled for 3 days, and then had come straight to Maisie's papa and told him the simple truth. She adored his daughter. She couldn't give her up. She'd make for her any sacrifice. On this basis, it had been arranged that she should stay. Her courage had been rewarded. She left Maisie in no doubt as to the amount of courage she had required. What did these adults do always? Always let the child know the cost, right? You've got to know the cost. Some of the things she said made a particular impression on the child. Her declaration, for instance, that when her pupil should get older, she'd understand better just how dreadfully bold a young lady to do exactly what she had done had to be. But now, this is a good example of, as we move into this indirect revelation, what's being referred to here? Someday you'll know, Maisie, that what I did took enormous courage. Only a very bold woman would do what I did. What's she referring to? Yeah, okay, going to the father's side, but why is that? Why is it something Maisie can't understand now that she will understand when she's an older person? Are they yet, do you think? Not yet, but possibility. Yeah. Yeah, right? Yes, they've already met in the park one day, right? She's got her eye on Beale. The Beale's got a nice smile, right? Yeah. So what is the dreadfully, where is the boldness? Where does it come from? That is, boldness in whose eyes is what I want to try to get. It's in the world's eyes, right? There are things that a lady doesn't do. A single young woman doesn't pick herself up, bag and baggage, and move into the house of a handsome divorced man. So it isn't a lot of boldness for Miss Overmore in terms of Beale, is it? But it's what is proper. So much of James's fiction has to do with what you and I have forgotten. I think, our modern, the proper standards of 1980 just are ridiculous, and vice versa. Well, I don't know if you ever love anybody in the beginning. I think she's attracted to him. And my feeling about Miss Overmore right now, and she doesn't get very high on my scale of admiration counter, is that she's amused and titillated, and she's young, and there is an excuse. This child needs a governess, and life is going to be a heck of a lot more interesting at Beale's house for her than at Ida's house. Maisie? No, I don't think she's uninterested in her, but she is one of the adults who puts number one first. Later on, you discover something interesting, and that is that, I wonder if I've got that here. There is a passage that I was looking at that I thought, gosh, it'd be fun to start off with this. It's in chapter 10. It explains a little bit, I think, of what is involved with this. It's in chapter 10, beyond the first series of dialogue. It starts out, it gave her moments of secret rapture. Page 84. The only mystification in this was the imposing time of life that her elders spoke of as youth. Right? What is youth? For Sir Claude, then, Mrs. Beale was young. Okay, that's Miss Overmore, right, after she marries. Just as for Mrs. Wicks, Sir Claude was. That was one of the merits for which Mrs. Wicks most commended him. What, therefore, was Maisie herself? And in another relation to the matter, what, therefore, was Mama? It took her some time to puzzle out, with the aid of an experiment or two, that it wouldn't do to talk about Mama's youth. She even went so far one day, in the presence of that lady's thick color and marked lines. What does it tell you about Ida? She's getting right to the fuel, and she's putting on a little bit, right, of marked lines, as to wonder if it would occur to anyone but herself to do so. Yet if she wasn't young, then she was old. Hear the child trying to figure these things out? And this threw an odd light on her having a husband of a different generation. Mr. Farang was still older, that Maisie perfectly knew, and it brought her in due course to the perception of how much more, since Mrs. Beale was younger than Sir Claude, Papa must be older than Mrs. Beale. Such discoveries were disconcerting and even a trifle confounding. These persons, it appeared, were not of the age they ought to be. Well, what has Maisie discovered about these adults? Who's the oldest? We go, so Beale is the oldest, and then Ida, and then Sir Claude, and then Mrs. or Overmore or Mrs. Beale. So he's married now to a woman at least a generation younger, and Ida is married to a younger man. So, what is Maisie trying to figure out? What is youth? Mrs. Wicks called Sir Claude young. Well, youth is all relative. I mean, to my students at East Side, I've got one foot in the grave. I mean, they look at me and they think, ha, 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 you know. I told them, they've been telling me I got to see this movie, Fatal Attraction. Oh, it's great. Which is about a man who has a one-night stand with a woman who then goes crazy and chases him all over and tries to kill his wife and him and his children. And I told the kids, I said, hey, I can't see that movie. It's too much like real life. I said, women have been chasing me all my life. They fall out of their chairs. Ha, ha, ha. You know. Well, they think I'm joking anyway. So that's one reason I like to come here, because Virginia always refers to me as this kid, see, this youngster. Okay. No, I went off on a tangent, didn't I? What was I saying? Yes. Okay. It's the matter of perception. What Maisie doesn't know is that already things are going on. That the real motivation behind Overmore's coming to Beale's has something to do with what a young woman feels like when she's young and beautiful in the employee of a woman who wants to be young and beautiful, but has probably got 20 years on her, and the light shines, right? In the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, when you see the gorgeous wife of the host for the first time, she is escorted by a old crone with great big fat hips, he says. Buttocks, I think. Fat buttocks is what Spencer says. And the students catch right away, my goodness, you know, there's nothing like getting an old crone next to a beautiful young woman to underscore the beauty. What you don't find out till the end of the poem is that old crone is Morgan Le Fay. And she's in charge of everything. Well, you know, Ida's not having any young, beautiful woman, right, next to her. So will Beale be happy to have a beautiful young woman in the house? Sure, yeah. Fortunately, your Papa appreciates it. He appreciates it immensely. The last paragraph in chapter 3. He appreciates it. Does Papa appreciate it? Page 47 in your book? Double language. This was one of the things Miss Overmore also said, with a striking insistence on the adverb. Maisie herself was no less impressed with what this martyr had gone through, especially after hearing of the terrible letter that had come from Mrs. Farang. Papa appreciates having this help, doesn't he? Yeah. And in chapter 4, we have to end now, we will meet next week as we begin Mrs. Wicks, who is a delightful Jamesian character. And I would like to go tomorrow, if you want to read ahead, probably halfway through the next section, picking up major passages. The big confrontation and the moral issues come week after next, when we finally decide who goes off with whom. And that's the beginning anyway. So I see a handful of you next week. You know.
The 10th poem, and it is the last. It is right at the last that 1 and 0 walk off together. Walk off the end of these pages together. One creature walking away side by side with the emptiness. Lastness is brightness. It is the brightness gathered up of all that went before. It lasts. And when it does end, there is nothing left. In the rust of old cars, in the hole torn open in the body of the archer, in river mists smelling of the weariness of stones, the dead lie, empty, filled, at the beginning, and the first voice comes craving again out of their mouths. That Bach concert I went to so long ago, the chandeliered room of ladies and gentlemen who would never die, the voices go out, the room becomes hushed. The violinist puts the irreversible sorrow of his face into the open palm of the wood. The music begins, a shower of rosin, the bow hairs listening down all their length to the wail, the sexual wail of the back alleys and blood strings we have lived, still crying, still singing from the sliced intestine of cat. This poem, if we shall call it that, or concert of one divided among himself, this earthward gesture of the skydiver, the worms on his back still spinning forth and already gnawing away the silks of his loves, who could have saved him, this free floating of one opening his arms into the attitude of flight as he obeys the necessity and falls? Oh, Sancho Fergus, don't cry, or else cry. On the body, on the blued flesh, when it is laid out, see if you can find the one flea which is laughing. Whole book, too. You really have to read the whole book to get it. And it's interesting in the way the book is done. These are old prints that he's found, and they're sort of astrological and so forth. And just the whole book is very, very interesting. I think we'll skip the still time. We're getting very close to the end here. But I'd like to read, and I think I'll read them because we can get it faster. From Mortal Acts, Mortal Words, these are two about his children, which are wonderful. About Fergus falling. He climbed to the top of one of those million white pines set out across the emptying pastures of the 50s, some program to enrich the rich and rebuke the forefathers who cleared it all at once with ox and axe. Climbed to the top probably to get out of the shadow, not of those forefathers, but of this father, and saw for the first time down in its valley Bruce Pond giving off its little steam in the afternoon. The pond where Clarence Ackley came on Sunday mornings to cut down the cedars around the shore. I'd sometimes hear the slow spondees of his work. He's gone. Where Milton Norway came up behind me while I was fishing and stood a while before I knew he was there. He's the one who put the cedar shingles on the house. Some have curled or split. A few have blown off. He's gone. Where Gus Newland logged in the cold snap of '58, the only man willing to go into those woods that never got warmer than 10 below. He's gone. Pond where 2 wards of the state wandered on Halloween. The National Guard searched for them in November in vain. The next fall, a hunter found their skeletons, huddled together in vain. They're gone. Pond where an old fisherman in a rowboat sits, drowning hooked worms while he goes. He is replaced and is never gone. And when Fergus saw the pond for the first time in the clear evening, saw its oldness down there in its old place in the valley, he became heavier suddenly in his bones, the way fledglings do just before they fly, and the soft pine cracked. I would not have heard his cry if my electric saw had been working, its carbide teeth speeding through the bland spruce of our time, or burning black arcs into some scavenged hemlock plank, like dark circles under eyes when the brain thinks too close to the skin. But I was sawing by hand, and I heard that cry as though he were attacked. We ran out. When we bent over him, he said, "Go away, Inez, I saw a pond." His face went gray. His eyes fluttered closed a frightening moment. Yes, a pond that lets off its mist on clear afternoons of August, in that valley to which many have come for their reasons, from which many have gone, a few for their reasons, most not, where even now an old fisherman, only the pine tops can see, sits in the dry gray wood of his rowboat, waiting for pickerel. And this next one is a very personal one, but it's sweet. I don't think it's objectionable, so I'm going to read it because I think it's lovely. After making love, we hear footsteps. If any of you who have been parents, this will relate to. For I can snore like a bullhorn, or play loud music, or sit up talking with any reasonably sober Irishman, and Fergus will only sink deeper into his dreamless sleep, which goes by all in one flash. But let there be that heavy breathing, or a stifled come cry anywhere in the house, and he will wrench himself awake and make for it on the run. As now we lie together after making love, quiet, touching along the length of our bodies, familiar touch of the long married, and he appears, in his baseball pajamas it happens, the neck opening so small he has to screw them on, which one day may make him wonder about the mental capacity of baseball players, and says, "Are you loving and snuggling? May I join?" He flops down between us and hugs us and snuggles himself to sleep, his face gleaming with satisfaction at being this very child. In the half-darkness, we look at each other and smile, and touch arms across his little, startlingly muscled body, this one whom habit of memory propels to the ground of his making. Sleeper, only the mortal sounds can sing awake. This blessing love gives again into our arms. What gorgeous? Yes.
Oh,
And then we're going to skip to page 8, and I'd like Virginia to read the Oregon Post.
On the Oregon coast, in memoriam to Richard Hugo. 6 or 7 rows of waves struggle landward. The wind batters a pewtery sheen on the water between them. As each wave makes its way in, most of it gets blown back out to sea, subverting even necessity. The bass rumble of sea stones, audible when the waves flee all broken back out to sea, itself blows out to sea. Now a log, maybe 30 feet long and 6 across, gets up and trundles down the beach, like a dog fetching a stick that flops unhesitatingly into the water. An enormous wave at once sends it wallowing back up the beach again. It lies among other driftwood, almost panting. Sure enough, after a few minutes, it gets up, trundles down the beach, throws itself into the water again. The last time I was on this coast, Richard Hugo and I had dinner together just north of here, in a restaurant overlooking the sea. The conversation came around to personification. We agreed that 18th and 19th century poets almost had to personify. It was like mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, the only way they could imagine to keep the world from turning into dead matter.